3 years later, Margaret passed away. Cancer took her slowly, folding her into herself piece by piece. Catherine remained in the house alone, the walls closing around her, the silence pressing in. She died in 2007, heart failure, they said. But those who knew her whispered something different. They said she died of waiting, that she'd spent too many nights staring through the dark, listening for footsteps that never came. After their deaths, the house was sold. A young couple moved in, peeled back wallpaper, replaced floors, opened windows that hadn't been unlatched in decades. They found no secret rooms, no buried notes, no clues hidden in the walls. Just dust, old wood, and the faint hint of lavender from a bottle long turned dry. But the woods behind the house remained the same, dense, quiet, steeped in shadows that daylight couldn't fully wash away. The couple's dog refused to go past the first line of trees. It would stand stiff at the border, hackles raised, staring into the green gloom as though something unseen stared back. They laughed about it at first. Then they stopped laughing. Eventually, they moved. No one stays long in that house. In the decades since the sisters' return, the case has been re-examined by armchair detectives, amateur historians, and late-night radio hosts. People proposed theories that the girls had lived with drifters, that they'd joined a traveling sect, that they'd invented Thomas as a way to explain the unexplainable. But each theory frayed with even gentle scrutiny, and every retelling, no matter how loud or confident, returned to the same disturbing truth. There was never a trace. Not one. Not a footprint. Not a tool. Not a scrap of the so-called house. It was as if the place had been swallowed back into the land the moment the girls left it. Maybe that's the part that sits worst with people. The idea that something can exist completely, undeniably, and then vanish without leaving evidence of its reality. Humans need proof. We cling to it. Without proof, we doubt even the stories we can feel in our bones. Margaret and Catherine knew that. They lived with that disbelief every day. Somewhere carved deep inside the Appalachians, among ridges untouched by maps, where the forest grows so thick it forgets its own paths, there might once have been a house, a door, a man with thinning hair and a forgettable smile, a life rewritten for two children who became women in a darkness that was never meant for them. Or maybe that house is still there. Or maybe Thomas is. And maybe there are other stories like this. Quiet disappearances, innocent walks into the woods, families who never see their children again. Stories that end not with bodies found, but with nothing at all. Because not every evil introduces itself. Some simply waits. The Dalton case sits open in a cabinet somewhere, gathering dust. A file among thousands, too strange to close, too empty to solve. Most people have stopped looking, but not everyone. Somewhere tonight, someone is thinking about the sisters standing barefoot on the roadside. Someone is wondering how they found the strength to walk away. And someone else is wondering if they truly walked away, or if they were simply released, and if the man who released them ever looked back. Because the woods in eastern Kentucky are deep, deeper than roads, deeper than memory, deeper, sometimes, than truth. And some doors, once opened, don't close. Ruth died quietly in 1984, leaving the two sisters alone in the house she had kept waiting for them. They didn't remodel it, didn't repaint. They lived with everything exactly as it had been, as if altering the walls might disturb something fragile in the air. And still, they never changed their story. Even decades later, when they were grown women with gray creeping into their hair, Margaret and Catherine's voices remained steady when asked about Thomas. They recounted the same details, the same cadence, the same lingering pauses that suggested they were not remembering so much as reliving. Thomas was real. The house was real. And what happened to them was not a fable or a cover story. This certainty only intensified the discomfort in the people around them. As long as the sisters lived, the town of Harland could never fully convince itself that their story was simply the invention of frightened, long-gone children. It sat like a stone at the bottom of a well, heavy, impossible to pull up, impossible to ignore. Once, in 1998, a journalist from Louisville requested an interview. He sat across from the sisters at their kitchen table, his tape recorder propped between them. He had a list of questions, mapped out, chronological, precise. But the sisters' answers bent around his structure like water around rock. What did the house look like? Silence. What direction did the trail run? A shake of the head. Did Thomas ever strike you? A long pause, then. He didn't need to. When the journalist tried to push further, Catherine's eyes drifted toward the window, the one that faced the woods. She stared so intently that even he felt something tighten in his chest, as if she were waiting for the sound of branches cracking under someone's weight. He ended the interview early. On the drive back to Louisville, he reportedly pulled off the highway, stepped out of his car, and vomited on the gravel. Not because of gore or violence, there was none in their story, but because of the quiet certainty in their voices. Because there was no tremor, no hesitation, no sign that they were recalling a memory. They were reciting a life lived in someone else's shadow. The graduate student who interviewed them in 2003 had a similar experience. She described the sisters as kind, gracious, soft-spoken, and carrying a fear so old it no longer looked like fear. She asked them finally the question everyone avoided. Do you think Thomas is still alive? Margaret didn't answer. Catherine did. I think people like him don't die when we want them to. Ruth Dalton refused interviews. She took her daughters home and kept them close for the rest of her life. The house on the edge of Harland became a quiet place, the curtains always drawn. Margaret never married, never left town again. Catherine tried to start a new life once, in Lexington, but returned within 6 months. Those who lived nearby said the sisters were polite, though touched by something unnameable. Sometimes, late at night, neighbors claimed they saw the two women standing in the yard, hand in hand, facing the tree line, as though listening for footsteps. Margaret died in 2004. Cancer. Catherine followed 3 years later. Heart failure. Neither ever altered their story. When asked about it, twice by reporters, once by a graduate student, they simply repeated it, the same way every time. Thomas was real. The house was real. And whether people believed them or not had nothing to do with the truth they carried. What lingers in the air after all these years is not the question of what happened. It's the question of why so many refused to accept it. Because believing them means accepting something far more disturbing than myth. It means accepting that a man could steal 2 children from a roadside, hide them in plain sight, and vanish from history without leaving a mark. That some acts of evil slip beneath detection, not because they are supernatural, but because they are ordinary. Too ordinary. And that is a truth most people would rather shut a door on. The case remains technically open, though no one is searching anymore. Except, perhaps, the people who come across this story late at night and find themselves wondering whether Thomas ever stopped walking, whether he found another town, Another pair of children, whether somewhere in the dense, uncharted dark, another door opened and stayed closed for far too long. They were never the same after they returned. Margaret and Catherine. People said it softly, as though the words might wound them even from a distance. The Dalton sisters moved through Harland like shadows, polite but distant, always watchful. They didn't linger in grocery aisles or church pews. They spoke quietly, and only when spoken to. And yet, for all their effort to blend back into the rhythm of small-town life, something about them stayed just slightly out of sync, like a clock that ticks steadily but never quite keeps the hour. Some evenings, neighbors claimed they saw the sisters standing side by side in their backyard, silhouettes under the thin moonlight, holding hands the way they had on that September morning. They would stand perfectly still, gazing into the tree line as though listening for a voice only they could hear. Whether it was fear or longing that kept their eyes fixed on the dark, no one ever asked. But the questions people didn't ask hung as heavily as the ones they did. The truth is, almost no one wanted to press them, because pressing them meant confronting the possibility that what they said was real, that a man had built a private world inside the hills and ruled it with his own logic, that 2 children could disappear within a 2-mile walk and remain hidden for more than a decade, that the woods surrounding Harland were not simply beautiful or quiet or old, but capable of swallowing lives whole. And that possibility was far more frightening than any ghost story the region had ever whispered into the dark. Time passed. The years blurred. Ruth Dalton, who had held her daughters so tightly the day they returned that her nails left small crescent marks on their skin, began to age faster than those around her. Some said the guilt of surviving those 11 years without them had carved its way into her bones. Others believed it was something colder, a fear that lingered, never spoken aloud, that perhaps Thomas might come back for what he believed was his. When people hear a story like this, they assume certain horrors. Catherine addressed that directly. She said Thomas never touched them in the way people expect. He didn't need to. The fear of his footsteps, the weight of his gaze, the claustrophobic rituals that filled their days, those were violations of another kind. Quieter, maybe, but no less devastating. He called it discipline. He called it love. And in the warped, sealed-off world he built for them, those words almost made sense. Margaret confessed there were stretches, weeks, months, maybe years, when she forgot there had ever been another life. When Ruth's face felt like a dream, when the thought of leaving the house frightened her more than staying, because at least the rules there were familiar. At least she knew what was expected. If you're still watching, the narrator inside me wants to say, you're braver than most. But courage is meaningless here. What matters is endurance, and the quiet, terrible understanding that none of this happened in a distant world. It happened to 2 girls from a small mountain town. It happened in a house that may still be standing somewhere in the folds of the hills. The question that echoed through the sheriff's office long after the sisters stopped speaking was simple. Why now? Why, after 11 years of obedience, did Thomas let them go? Margaret's answer chilled the room in a way no threat could. Because he told us to. One morning, she said, he opened the front door. No warning, no speech. He handed each of them a pair of shoes. Shoes that didn't fit, but were better than bare feet. He told them to walk east until they found a road, then keep walking until someone helped them. He kissed their foreheads, called them good girls, and then stepped into the trees. They never saw him again. Catherine said she didn't know if he was testing them, if he hid among the branches with a rifle, waiting to punish disobedience. But Margaret took her hand, and together they walked. Through the thick woods, through the unfamiliar underbrush, until the forest thinned and the old county road appeared before them. That was where Earl Simmons found them. Two pale figures in shoes not their own. The investigation began the same day. Officers trudged through the hills, dogs barking into the quiet. Helicopters circled, their blades chopping the air into nervous rhythms. Flyers were printed. Descriptions circulated. They questioned miners, farmers, widows, hunters, anyone who might know of a house deep enough in the woods to disappear from memory. Nothing. No house. No Thomas. Not a single piece of evidence that two girls had been kept alive in the mountains for 11 long, empty years. Worse still, the details began to slip through the girls' fingers. Margaret couldn't recall if the place had one floor or two. Catherine remembered chickens roaming outside, but Margaret insisted there were none. They couldn't agree on the direction they walked, or whether the trail sloped uphill or down. Pressing them only fractured them further. They would go silent, stare at the floor, and drift back into whatever internal place they had lived in for more than a decade. After 2 weeks, the search was scaled back. After a month, people started talking, whispering, doubting. The story had holes, 100 little contradictions, and in the absence of answers, people patched those holes with disbelief. In November of 1963, the official report was filed. It claimed Margaret and Catherine Dalton had likely run away back in 1952. That the years unaccounted for were spent drifting among mining camps or abandoned shacks, surviving, however, two girls could. And that the tale of their captivity was a fiction, not out of malice, but out of shame, confusion, or a shared delusion that bound their memories together. Doctors disagreed. One said the sisters showed signs of prolonged trauma, the kind no wandering or vagrancy could reasonably explain. Another diagnosed them with what he called folie à deux, a rare psychological entanglement where two people shape each other's false memories until neither can separate truth from invention. The local newspaper ran a small column, suggesting the girls had simply been lost to the world for too long and invented a story to cover the stains of those years. People read it with their morning coffee, nodded, and folded the paper away, satisfied to let the matter rest. And then, on September 24th, 1963, they came back. Not broken, not found in a ditch or dragged from a river. They emerged from the tree line like two shadows stepping back into the world, their fingers entwined, wearing clothes too big for their small frames and shoes that didn't belong to them. Margaret was 25 now, Catherine 21. But Earl Simmons would later insist they looked younger, smaller, as though something inside them had stayed frozen in the moment they disappeared. Protocol brought them straight to the sheriff's office, a pale green room with a table that wobbled each time someone breathed too hard. For 3 hours, they sat silent. They didn't respond to questions. They didn't speak to each other. They only held hands, their gazes locked somewhere just beyond the wall. Nothing changed until Ruth arrived. When she saw them, grown women but still unmistakably her children, she fell to her knees, sobbing so violently it sounded like she was tearing herself open. It was only then that Margaret finally spoke. "We stayed because he told us to." That was all. No tears, no tremor in her voice. Just a flat, emptied-out sentence, delivered like an echo of something learned long ago. The officers pressed her. Who was he? Where had they been? Why now? Margaret turned to Catherine. Catherine nodded, and together They unraveled a story that would cling to every person in that room for the rest of their lives. They said his name was Thomas. No last name. They didn't know where he came from, or how long he'd been watching them. But Margaret remembered him standing at the edge of the woods that Saturday morning, waiting in the shade like someone who'd been expecting them. He wasn't tall, not strong. A man in his 40s with thinning hair, a face you could forget the moment you blinked. And that forgettable, ordinary look. That was what made them trust him. He told them their mother had been in an accident, that she'd sent him, that they needed to come quickly without making a fuss. And because they were raised to obey adults, to listen, to be good girls, they followed him down a narrow path that didn't appear on any map. A path that led to a place they wouldn't leave for 11 years. He kept them in what Catherine called a house. But the way she described it, it sounded more like a sealed chamber in the heart of the hills, so far from the world, so drowned in silence, that even screaming felt like a wasted effort. No neighbors, no roads. Every door locked from the outside, windows boarded. Thomas living among them like a keeper of some private, terrible order. He fed them, dressed them, taught them to sew, to clean, to stay quiet, forced them to call him father, and punished them when they didn't. If they cried or begged or tried to ask about their real mother, he locked them in a narrow room where they couldn't stand, couldn't lie down, couldn't do anything but endure. Margaret said her longest stretch in that space was 4 days. Catherine said she stopped counting. The police kept pressing for details, anything they could use to locate the house. But the sisters could give nothing. No dates, no landmarks, no seasons they could anchor to. Time had dissolved for them. Days bled into weeks. Weeks vanished into something shapeless. Eventually, they stopped hoping. Eventually, they stopped remembering what life had once felt like. And survival meant surrendering to his rules. They said Thomas governed the house the way some men rule kingdoms, with rules that sounded holy when he spoke them, and monstrous when they were carried out. They were to rise at dawn, no matter how little they had slept. They were to pray before every meal, thanking God for his mercy and Thomas for his provision, the words merging until the two became almost interchangeable. They could not speak unless spoken to. They could not look out the windows, even through the cracks between the boards. They could not ask questions about the world beyond the trees. He told them the world had ended, that everyone they loved was gone, that he had saved them, plucked them from ruin, and that stepping outside without him would mean death. And in the beginning, even Margaret admitted, it was easy to believe him. They were children, and he was the only voice they heard, the only source of truth in a place where time and reason slid away like water through fingers. They found them on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1963. 2 young women standing barefoot beside a narrow county road just outside Harlan, Kentucky, their hands clasped as if they were children again, waiting for someone who had long since slipped out of their world. The mist hadn't burned off yet. It hung low across the pavement, soft and gray, curling around their ankles. A truck driver named Earl Simmons spotted them first. He said they didn't wave him down or cry out. They only watched him approach, watched him slow his engine, their eyes following him with a kind of hollow certainty. Eyes, he kept repeating, that looked like they had witnessed something even God would turn away from. He radioed the sheriff. By noon, word had spread across Harlan like a sharp breath. The Dalton girls were back. After 11 years, they had returned. Alive. And if things followed the shape of normal stories, If this were the kind of tale small towns could understand, then that would have been the end of it. A miracle. A relief. But what the girls said, when they finally opened their mouths to speak, gutted whatever peace Harlan tried to construct around them. Not one person believed their explanation. Not the officers, not the doctors, not even their own mother. And the disbelief wasn't born from impossibility. It was the opposite. Their story was too possible, too near the bone, too familiar, too human. The kind of truth that reminds you the monsters you fear don't live in the attic or crawl from the dark. They sit beside you at supper. They hold the door open at the grocery. They share your blood. Before we begin, you know the drill. Leave a comment. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. What hour of night has you wandering these stories with us? It helps keep tales like this one drifting into your feed, for better or worse. This is what Margaret and Catherine Dalton confessed, and why, more than 60 years later, most people still refuse to believe them. It was August 9th, 1952. A Saturday soaked in heat. The kind of heavy Appalachian summer day when the air clings to the skin like damp cloth, and even the dogs refuse to lift their heads from the shade. Margaret was 14. Catherine was 10. Their mother, Ruth, gave them a short list scrawled in pencil and $3 folded into an envelope. Eggs, flour, a bottle of aspirin. Nothing unusual. They had walked those 2 miles into town 100 times before. By noon, they should have been back. By dinner, Ruth was pacing the porch boards until they creaked under her weight. By midnight, she was out behind the house, calling their names into the woods until her voice splintered in her throat. The sheriff's department organized a search at dawn. 30 men, dogs straining against their leashes, volunteers from 3 neighboring counties. They swept through the hills, dragged the creek, knocked on doors from one end of Harlan to the other. But the land gave nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no scrap of fabric clinging to a thorn. It was as though the earth itself had opened its jaws and swallowed the girls whole. In small towns, silence becomes a story. Soon, the whispered theories twisted into a kind of folklore. Some insisted the girls had run off, said Margaret was wild or pregnant or angry enough to leave her life behind. Others spoke of drifters who wandered through the mountains in the summers, chasing work in the mines. A few of the older folks, people who still believed the woods carried old things, nameless things, claimed the girls had been taken by something not born of human hands. But Ruth Dalton refused all of it. She knew her daughters, knew they wouldn't run, wouldn't vanish into the trees without a reason. And somewhere deep in the quiet, instinctive place where mothers keep their unspoken truths, she believed they were still alive. She was right, but she would spend the next 11 years wishing she had been wrong. 11 years changes everything. Long enough for faces to blur, for towns to reshape themselves around absence. Long enough for a mother to stop setting extra plates, even though her hands never stopped trembling when she opened the cupboard. The missing posters faded, peeled from telephone poles in feathery curls, leaving only stains where the glue had been. By 1963, most of Harlan had moved on. Ruth hadn't. She kept their room exactly as it was. The quilts folded neatly at the foot of the beds. The windows kept clean, as if the girls might look in one evening and decide to stay. Every dusk, she walked to the edge of her property and stood, a lone figure against the dying light, as though her presence could be a beacon bright enough to pull them home.